When you strip away the slogans and emotional headlines, the war in Ukraine stops looking like a moral fairy tale about democracy versus autocracy and starts looking like what it really is, a textbook case of great power politics playing out exactly as serious realists have warned for decades. If you read John Mearsheimer, Henry Kissinger, or even Alexander Dugin carefully, you realize that far from being irrational or unhinged, Russia is behaving precisely as one would expect a great power to behave when it sees a hostile military bloc creeping toward its borders. That's the uncomfortable truth Western elites refuse to face, because accepting it would mean admitting that this catastrophe is not the result of one villain in the Kremlin, but the predictable outcome of a reckless Western strategy colliding with Russian national interests. International politics is a ruthless, anarchic business. There is no world government, no global police force, no benevolent referee to guarantee anyone's safety. Each great power lives in a self-help system where survival depends not on virtue signaling, but on raw power. That is the essence of what Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. A great power is not defined by its speeches, but by its material capabilities, military strength, economic base, population, resources, and by its ability to defend its core interests without relying on others. By that standard, Russia is undeniably a great power. A vast territory spanning Eurasia, enormous natural resources, a large and educated population, nuclear parity with the United States, and a serious conventional military. It will not quietly accept being treated as a geopolitical afterthought. In this anarchic system, certain rules never change. Great powers fear each other because there is no higher authority to protect them if things go wrong. They build offensive capabilities because they can never be sure what others will do tomorrow. They can never be certain of intentions, so they balance against capabilities, not promises. And they put survival above all else, which often means seeking regional dominance, or at least denying hostile blocs the ability to dominate their neighborhood. Apply these principles to post-Cold War Europe, and Russia's behavior stops looking like madness and starts looking like realism 101. NATO's relentless march eastward right up to the Russian frontier violates the most basic rule of great power politics. No serious power will tolerate a hostile alliance on its immediate border. The United States understood this in 1962 when it threatened nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. Yet Washington and Brussels pretend to be shocked that Moscow reacts to NATO infrastructure approaching Kharkov and the Donbass as if nothing is happening. From a realist perspective, that posture is either dishonest or delusional. Mearsheimer's framework of offensive and defensive realism helps us understand why Ukraine became the flashpoint. Offensive realists argue that great powers always seek to maximize their share of power when the opportunity presents itself. Defensive realists emphasize the imperative of survival and security. From Moscow's viewpoint, NATO expansion into Ukraine was an offensive move by the West, encroaching on Russia's historical buffer zone, threatening its Black Sea access, and pushing a rival military infrastructure into a space Russians see as intimately tied to their own state and civilization. From Washington and Brussels, the same process was sold as a defensive project, a sovereign Ukraine choosing to join a peaceful alliance. But realism does not care about packaging. States do not evaluate NATO or any other alliance by its press releases. They evaluate it by its tanks, missiles, bases, and record of intervention. That is why Russian leaders repeatedly framed NATO's advance and the militarization and westernization of Ukraine as an existential threat. Whether Western elites mean well is irrelevant. What matters is how a nuclear-armed great power perceives the shift in the balance of power. Defensive realists understand this perfectly. If you push a rival great power into a corner, tightening the strategic noose around its borders, you don't get peace, you get war. Russia did not wake up one morning and decide to be aggressive for fun. It reacted to a pattern. Broken informal assurances about NATO's non-expansion, the 2014 upheaval in Kyiv that Moscow saw as a Western-backed coup, years of arming and training Ukrainian forces, and the steady integration of Ukraine into NATO's military and political orbit without formal membership. From a Russian security perspective, that equation was unsustainable. Layered on top of this realist structure is the deceptive language of Western liberal rhetoric. The West likes to imagine that it runs foreign policy on liberal principles: human rights, democracy, promotion, the rule of law. In reality, its actions follow a very familiar logic of power. Kissinger captured this duality well when he described America's divided soul. One part isolationist, focused on perfecting democracy at home as a shining example. The other missionary, convinced it must export its values to the rest of the world. Underneath both impulses lies an unshakable belief that the United States embodies the best system and has a right, even a duty, to shape global politics. Liberal ideology introduces a dangerous illusion: the notion that there are good and bad states and that spreading democracy automatically reduces conflict. This narrative becomes a blank check for intervention, regime change, color revolutions, and expansions like NATO's push eastward, all justified as steps toward a more peaceful world. Yet nationalism is a far more powerful force than liberalism. People do not live and die for abstract rights charters. They live and die for nations, histories, languages, and land. When liberal hegemony clashes with national interests and identity, especially those of a great power, nationalism wins every single time. Russia is not simply a regime. It is a civilization state with a deep historical identity, a strong sense of its own security perimeter, and a population that, despite internal fractures, broadly accepts that NATO on its doorstep is unacceptable. It is naive in the extreme to think you can roll a Western security architecture up to the Russian border, encourage anti-Russian nationalism in Ukraine, and then complain that Moscow refuses to behave as a passive spectator. Western elites misread both Russian nationalism and their own. They assumed the world would accept their moral framing, even as they engaged in classic balance of power maneuvering. They preached liberalism while practicing realism, and Moscow responded according to realism, not rhetoric. To grasp why this war happened, you need what I would call strategic sympathy. Not emotional sympathy and not moral approval, but the intellectual discipline to see the world as Moscow sees it, just as Washington demanded the world understand its reaction to Cuba in 1962. From the Russian vantage point, NATO expansion eastwards violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the understandings at the end of the Cold War. The 2014 events in Kyiv installed a government that many in Moscow viewed as hostile, nationalist, and openly aligned with Western interests. The progressive arming and training of Ukrainian forces, integration with NATO structures, and constant talk of NATO membership pointed toward a future in which Ukraine would host Western weapon systems minutes from major Russian cities. The status of Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass was not just a humanitarian or political question, but a matter of influence, leverage, and identity. Given those perceptions, Russia's decision to intervene, however costly, is entirely consistent with the way great powers behave when their vital security interests are at stake. It is the same logic that guided the United States in both world wars and the Cold War: prevent a hostile bloc from dominating a critical region or placing threatening infrastructure too close for comfort. Western leaders insist NATO is purely defensive and has no intention of attacking Russia. Perhaps they believe that. But great powers do not balance intentions. They balance capabilities. Intentions can change overnight after elections, coups, or crises. Russia cannot afford to stake its survival on the long-term stability of Western political promises, so when NATO moved ever closer, refused to rule out Ukrainian membership, and effectively turned Ukraine into a forward NATO outpost in all but name, Russia responded the way any serious great power would. It moved to change the facts on the ground. Realism also offers a vocabulary to describe how Ukraine itself has been used by its supposed protectors. Concepts like buck passing, bait and bleed, and bloodletting are not academic abstractions. They describe exactly what we have seen. Buck passing occurs when an endangered state offloads the burden of confronting a rival onto someone else. The EU and NATO offloaded the frontline risks of confronting Russia onto Ukraine, dangling membership, political support, and weapons, while avoiding direct confrontation themselves. Bait and bleed involves enticing a rival into a conflict that drains its strength without draining your own. By pushing NATO structures and political promises eastward, supporting Kyiv's hard line, and refusing serious compromise on Russian red lines, the West effectively baited Russia into an intervention and then used the conflict to bleed Russian power through a prolonged war of attrition at minimal direct cost in Western lives. In this framework, Ukraine becomes both a battering ram and a sponge, a way to strike at Russia's power and absorb Russian resources, while the human bill is paid in Ukrainian blood. History also explains why Russia is prepared to endure enormous pain rather than back down. Populations can absorb staggering levels of suffering without overthrowing their governments, especially when they believe the war is existential. Strategic bombing did not make the Japanese overthrow their emperor. Blockades and destruction did not yield the mass uprising strategists once imagined. The more sunk costs, the more leaders and societies are locked into seeing the war through, hoping for a better outcome rather than accepting humiliation. The idea that you can simply decapitate Russian leadership, remove one man, and cause the entire strategy to collapse is fantasy. States are not one person. They are institutions, elites, identities, and historical narratives. Remove one figure and someone even more hardline can emerge. In Russia's case, the notion that eliminating Putin would magically produce a pro-Western liberal regime is strategically illiterate and potentially dangerous. Nuclear weapons add another layer to this tragedy. Some argue that because nuclear weapons exist, conventional wars between great powers are irrational and obsolete. That is wishful thinking. Nuclear arsenals have created mutual deterrence at the strategic level, but nobody really knows how a modern great power conflict might escalate under that shadow. Land power control of territory still matters enormously. Nuclear weapons deter total annihilation, but they do not seize ports, protect pipelines, or physically secure borders. Russia's calculus in Ukraine is rooted in this reality. It must shape the military and political geography of its western frontier in ways that make it secure regardless of theoretical nuclear exchange scenarios. Western missile defenses and anti-ballistic systems, often sold as steps away from nuclear dependence, actually tempt strategists to believe they can fight limited nuclear exchanges while protecting their own population centers. That makes the nuclear dimension of any confrontation more, not less dangerous. Against that backdrop, Russia's insistence on a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine looks less like aggression and more like an attempt to stabilize a buffer zone before the security situation becomes unmanageable. Europe itself presents a paradox that directly impacts the Russian question. Historically, it invented the tools of great power, politics, nation-states, sovereignty, balance of power. But today, individual European states have surrendered significant sovereignty to a supranational project, the European Union. The EU, however, is not a classical great power in the realist sense. It is an institution that wields ideology, norms, and economic levers as its primary instruments. It weaponizes values, human rights, rule of law, social liberalism, and uses sanctions, financial pressure, regulatory power, and moral condemnation as coercive tools. This is less old-style imperialism than a moralized or woke imperialism that seeks to shape the internal life of states as a condition for partnership. Against a hard power actor like Russia, that strategy runs into brutal limits. Values do not stop tanks. Cancel campaigns do not deter artillery. Sanctions hurt, but they also reorder global markets and create new alignments, sometimes strengthening alternative systems and accelerating de-Westernization. When Russia reintroduced old-fashioned power politics, hard military force on Europe's doorstep, the EU initially reacted as though someone had broken the script of a postmodern performance. The panic over energy, the sudden rediscovery of defense spending, the frantic search for ammunition, all of this reveals that beneath the liberal gloss, European elites still understand realpolitik. They just prefer not to admit it publicly. The EU's internal contradictions, diverging interests, different threat perceptions, dependency on American security guarantees make coherent strategy difficult. Smaller states cling to NATO and EU structures as existential lifelines. Larger states like Germany and France may eventually conclude that their long-term interests diverge from Washington's appetite for confrontation, especially as economic and social costs mount. In that fluid context, Russia is both a threat and a potential partner, a competitor at the gates, but also an indispensable neighbor for any serious European power that wants strategic autonomy rather than permanent subordination to the United States. Over all of this looms the other great fact of the century, China's rise. The United States enjoys a unique geographical advantage. It dominates the Western Hemisphere and faces no serious military threat on its own borders, which allows it to project power into Europe and Asia to prevent regional hegemons from emerging. That is why it intervened in both world wars and why it built NATO. In the 21st century, China's rise is the central strategic challenge for Washington. From a realist perspective, the United States will go to great lengths to contain Beijing, deepening security ties with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, India, and others. Where does Russia fit into this picture? If the U.S. remains locked in a zero-sum confrontation with Moscow, it pushes Russia deeper into China's embrace, turning a major Eurasian power into a resource appendage and junior partner of Beijing. If Washington were serious about long-term strategy, it would seek some form of normalization with Moscow, accepting Russia's security claims in Europe in exchange for a degree of distance between Moscow and Beijing. In other words, the rational move for the United States is not to destroy or humiliate Russia in Ukraine, but to reach a settlement that allows Russia to remain an independent pole